It's so good to see you all today, and for joining us on this lovely Sunday afternoon. I want to welcome everybody here in the room with us. I'm also going to take a moment to welcome those of you who are joining us via Zoom. We are doing this lecture simultaneously in person and online. And for those of you who are joining us on Zoom, just to let you know that that my colleague Sean is monitoring the chat and the Q&A. So if you do have any questions while you're watching online, feel free to drop those questions using the Q&A feature, and we'll make sure at the end of the lecture that that we share them with Pete so that you can participate in the discussion with us here as well. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kate Zullo. I am the educator here at the Litchfield Historical Society. And it is my pleasure to sort of be the housekeeping person for this afternoon. So before we dive into our lecture, just a few little notes. We are doing some surveying, so if you're on Zoom, a survey will pop up at the end of this lecture. If you have a minute or two to fill that out, that would be greatly appreciated. And those of you who are with us in the room, we do have a little survey station as you're headed out today. Just jot a few notes about your thoughts on today so that we know if you guys want more lectures from Pete. I'm sure the answer will be yes. We also have a lot of great stuff coming up this summer here at the Historical Society. We're kind of moving into our summer programming, which means we have walking tours and gallery tours, programs down in the meadow, 4th of July coming up for our pet parade. So if you haven't already, sign up for our e-blast, for our email newsletter, or follow us on social media is a great way to keep in touch with everything that we have going on so you don't miss anything. All right, so with that said, it's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Pete, who is first and foremost a very valued member of the board of directors here at the Litchfield Historical Society. And you've been on the board how many years now? 11. 11 years. I can't wait for at least 11 more. Peter Vermilyea teaches history at Housatonic Valley Regional High School in Falls Village. He's a graduate of Gettysburg College and is the director of the Student Scholarship Program at his alma mater, Civil War Institute. He is the author of Hidden History of Litchfield County, Wicked Litchfield County, and of course, why we are all here today, his newest book, Litchfield County and the Civil War. And if you haven't read any of those books, you absolutely should. And the best place to get them is in the back of the room at the end of the lecture. And we are just thrilled to have Pete with us here today. Pete, thank you so much.
I became the secretary of the Historical Society 5 years ago, and Kathy Fields told me that the tenure of the secretary is 47 years. That's the average tenure. And I think that's true. I think that is the average tenure. And so I have 42 years left, Kate, on my term. The Historical Society is very special to me. And all historical societies in our area are. Projects like this are not possible without the work done at local historical societies. So I'm very grateful for the work to the staff, especially Linda Hocking, who tomorrow begins a new job as the archivist of the law collection at Yale, and we'll miss her greatly. But her work is instrumental in this book. So a very special thank you to Linda, and very special thank you to Rosie Furness, the president of the Historical Society, for everything that she does. I'm very grateful. And this is, you don't need to see anything else. This is what it is to be a teacher. There's no one in the front row. No one. And the teacher in me feels very compelled to have some former students who are all the way in the back come up and sit up here in the front, but we won't do that. I want to tell you about what the heart of this book. The heart of this book is about the summer of 1862. This is not a good title for the book. I will be completely upfront. The History Press, Arcadia Publishing are wonderful to work with. This was not my choice for a title because it makes it sound like this is about the whole war, and it's not about the whole war. This book ends in September of 1862, when 2,000 men from Litchfield County marched off to war. This is a story about how our community got ready for war, what had to be done, not just in terms of getting recruits and equipping those recruits and training those recruits, all of which is covered in the book, but also in terms of how do you develop the mindset to get ready for war? So before we talk about that, this book started about this time years ago when I was out for a run along the West Cemetery, not so far from here. And the Boy Scouts had just marked the graves for Memorial Day. And I saw a grave that had three flags on a grave. And I stopped to look, and this was the grave of the Wadhams brothers, Edward and Henry and Luman. Three young men from Litchfield and Goshen who died within 10 days of each other in three separate battles in May and June 1864. Luman Wadhams died 160 years ago yesterday. Here's how bad it was. Deacon Adams from the Congregational Church got the news that one of the Wadhams brothers had died, and he was given the task to ride out to the house and break the news to the parents, which he did. And on his way back, he met a messenger, and the messenger said, "What are you doing?" "I just was at the Wadhams house. I'm on my way back to the church." He said, "No, you need to turn around and go back to the Wadhams house because we just learned another brother has fallen." This project started trying to understand that. How does a community deal with grief on that scale? 141 men from Litchfield County were killed on June 1st, 1864. How does a community deal with that kind of grief? And in trying to understand that, it brought me all the way back to the beginning of the war, when these bonds were established between the community and the men who went off to war. Okay, now, Rosie, we say this all the time, history is complicated. History is complicated. For most of us, this is the image of the start of the Civil War. This is the image that comes to mind. Flags waving, banners, huge crowds, men marching off to war. Or maybe this is the image, a more private moment. A young woman, a wife, a betrothed, a girlfriend, consecrating the sword of this young officer about to go off to war. These are the images we have, but if we think that all Northerners felt this way about the coming of the Civil War, we miss the point that the Northern home front was deeply divided, okay? And we hear about this. We hear about people called Copperheads who were pro-Southern Northerners. Or we hear that Lincoln had to imprison the Maryland legislature to keep them from seceding. But these people were also present in significant numbers in Litchfield County, right? And that's what I want to talk about today, all right? So I need your help. This is the audience participation part. I tend to wander. However, I need to stay here for the Zoom. So if I step out, give me a little wave. Just wave me back into the Zoom, okay? All right, let me say this real quick. When the war begins, there is a national movement to, in essence, do away with political parties. They said, let's just have one party called the Union Party. Put aside political differences during the war for the good of saving the country. And that idea, all right, begins in Litchfield County, right? I mean, there's other places where it's happening too, but Litchfield County is one of the earliest, and it's certainly the earliest place in Connecticut where this idea begins. Let's have a Union Party, no Democrats, no Republicans. And it lasts about a week, right? It doesn't last real long. And in Hampstead, the Democrats win the election. And the newspaper says this: the secession ticket was elected. So do you see what's going on immediately, right? Immediately, if you're a Democrat, you're a secessionist. So this is what we're getting at when we're talking about political divisions, all right? And here, oh, look, I love this picture so much. Here's Litchfield. There's so much in this picture. We could go on all afternoon about this picture, but it's so nice out that we're not going to. See the lake in the background? Right? You can't see the lake anymore. Although they say that when the new rooftop bar opens on the old courthouse, they say you're going to be able to see the lake from up there, which is great. Notice the wood buildings, right? They all burned down. And there's another picture of downtown Litchfield. It's a closer up and it's higher up. And I could never figure how they got this until I saw this picture. And do you see the flagpole? So that other picture was taken from that platform on the flagpole. But that flagpole is a symbol of the unity in the community at the very start of the war, because the town resolved upon hearing the news that the Confederates had fired on Fort Sumter to begin the war, April 1861, the town said, we want a 120-foot high flagpole put in the center of town. Now the flagpole that's out there right now is 60 feet high, right? So take that flagpole and double it. And you get the flagpole that was there in 1861. And the flag that flew was 30 feet by 30 feet. Colossal there on that flagpole. This is William Buckingham. He was the wartime governor of Connecticut. The governor served 6 one-year terms. He was elected 6 times, 7 times. All right, again and again. But he was nominated by a Union Party ticket in 1861. And about this convention, when the Union Party nominated him, one of the attendees, one of the leaders of the convention, wrote to the Litchfield Inquirer and said, it was on your hills, Litchfield County hills, that the first Union convention was held. There the present Union movement was born. You owe it to yourselves and the rest of the state that the hills speak in a voice not to be misunderstood next spring. Let treason, covert as well as open, be rebuked. In the midst of the Civil War, that makes sense to us, except the author of that letter did not mean that the Confederates were traitors or treasonists. He meant Democrats, right? Anyone who would dare speak out against the Lincoln administration was a traitor. So Litchfield County historically possessed a rich and diverse opposition to the war. Okay, and elections in its town the separate towns were quite close. Some opposition took the form of traditional political disagreement. Some opponents believed peace was more important than union, and others openly supported the Confederacy. Right? So you have people saying things like, our taxes are too high. We want lower taxes, traditional political arguments. Others saying the war is either going to cost too much money or too many lives. We shouldn't fight it. And others who are going to be pro-Confederate. Statewide, this opposition was evident in the 1860 presidential election. Lincoln, there's beardless Lincoln, won 53% of the vote in Connecticut. But the vote was split that year. Stephen Douglas was a Northern Democrat, and John C. Breckinridge was a fire breather, meaning pro-secessionist, pro-slavery Southern Democrat. And they finished in a virtual tie in Connecticut. Right? And so, while that might be surprising, we should also remember that William Lloyd Garrison called Connecticut the Georgia of New England. That Connecticut had more slaves than any other New England state in the 1790 census, and that Connecticut's industries were highly dependent upon Southern cotton. So while Litchfield County is the birthplace of both John Brown and Harriet Beecher Stowe, it also had some Southern sympathies. Now, at an individual level, war opponents were often those with family in the South. Immigrants often opposed the war, and those who supported slavery. In Litchfield County, there was a direct correlation between economic status and support of the war. Okay, the wealthy you were, the more likely you were to support the war. And here's a really important point. Americans in 1861 don't really have an active tradition of political dissent in wartime. Right? The Mexican War, which had been 15 years earlier, was very short and very small. The War of 1812, which had plenty of opponents, was 50 years ago. Okay? So Americans don't really know how to display their opposition to the war in wartime. Now, many of us have heard of the copperheads, right? That poisonous snake of the North. And the numbers of dissenters in the North was both large and impactful. Okay. Historian Jennifer Weber argues that the Democratic Party was so formidable an opponent to the Lincoln administration that it changed the way the Lincoln administration fought the war. Okay. And that it increased animosity at the local level, that it hurt recruiting efforts, and it politicized soldiers at the front. So at a national level, this dissent had a real tangible impact. And there were serious consequences for people who were too ardent, I should say, who were deemed too ardent in their dissent. All that was required to arrest and imprison a citizen were 2 sworn statements alleging disloyalty. Estimates of those who were imprisoned for speaking out against the war, this is nationwide, ranged between 13,000 and 38,000, right? So if we split the difference, we're somewhere like 25,000 Americans were imprisoned for speaking out against the war. But this is really important. Those are numbers of people imprisoned by the federal government, okay? Imprisoned by the federal government. The records on state and local governments are much scarcer, okay? We should also note that while the First Amendment, of course, protects our freedom of speech, if it's 1861, the First Amendment, as it says now, says Congress shall make no law. But it's not until the 14th Amendment that protection is that protection from state governments is granted to citizens. right? So Connecticut could have laws saying you can't say this or you can't say that. There's also widespread disagreement among Northerners about what loyalty was and what disloyalty was. So the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, he said that, quote, the line between loyalty and disloyalty is plainly defined. Anyone can tell who's loyal and who's disloyal. But Horace Bushnell, who was born a few miles down the road, right, who was a prominent theologian and public figure, he was more nuanced in his view. He said, not every disloyal person is a traitor, right? Not every disloyal person is a traitor. He believed that loyalty during a war required defending the country and being willing to risk one's life for the Union. But he didn't believe that those who were unwilling to do that were necessarily traitors, right? There's a middle ground. All right. So the one other piece of the puzzle, two other pieces of the puzzle that I think we need to understand before we start to look at what's going on in Litchfield County specifically. One, Litchfield County elections are really close, really close. Some years the Democrats win, some years the Republicans win. Some towns are traditionally more Democratic, some towns they're traditionally more Republican. This isn't really anything new to us today. And the second thing is, Connecticut has a pretty rich history of supporting states' rights. So in the War of 1812, there was the Hartford Convention. And the Hartford Convention said that, in essence, states had a right to secede from the Union if they didn't agree with the War of 1812. Right? So there is this. We should look at Connecticut and Litchfield County as sort of this hot pot of dissent. Okay, dissent was so strong that in September 1861, the Winstead Herald declared that the, quote, increasing brazen disloyalty would be 50 years hence regarded as Connecticut's greatest shame. They were making a prediction about this looking forward. And since we're talking about the Winstead Herald, let me say that there were 3 newspapers in Litchfield County. They were all very strong Republican newspapers. There was the Winstead Herald, there was the Litchfield Inquirer, and there was the Housatonic Republican, which was out of Falls Village. The Litchfield Inquirer and the Housatonic Republican are right now digitized and available to view on the Library of Congress website. They are fantastic. You should check them out, if for nothing else than the advertisements. The advertisements are great, but they're also so important. So they say things like this. If it's 1860, the advertisements say things like Sawyer's shoes, best shoes in the county. But in 1862, they say things like this: march to Sawyer's shoes on the double. Right? And you see what's going on. The language is becoming militarized as the war progresses. But the other thing that is fascinating about the newspapers is you can go weeks without knowing there's a civil war going on, right? And I promise you that in the midst of giant battles, you see stories like this. Chicken in Norfolk lays giant eggs, right? In the midst of the Civil War, you get stuff like that, okay? All right. Opposition to the war began before the war itself began. So prior to April 1861, there was a patriotic meeting called in West Winstead. This is what they called it, a patriotic meeting. And a big crowd filled Camps Hall, and they expressed their support for Lincoln and the Union. However, Ronald Hitchcock rose to offer a resolution calling upon Lincoln to withdraw federal troops from Fort Sumter to, quote, stop the shedding of blood, settle the difficulties honorably by further concessions, and revive the drooping business interests. This didn't get anywhere. It was voted down nearly unanimously, and he was hissed off the stage. Hissed off the stage. Soon after the war began, Esther Thompson, she was a teenager during the war. This is a later picture of Esther Thompson. She noticed that, quote, copperhead pins were shamefully worn by a number of men in this town. These were a slice sawn through the center of a butternut, showing beautiful outlines and internal cavities, highly polished and covered with copper filings embedded in a heavy coat of varnish. People made some effort to display their opposition to the war. Dissent clearly existed at both the individual and organized group level. And the best symbol of opposition to the war were peace flags. Peace flags. Now, usually peace flags were simple white banners. Sometimes they would say peace on them, okay? And they appeared across the county. There were early accounts in New Milford and New Preston of peace flags. Most of the people who flew them were not pro-Confederate, but rather they agreed with Thomas Seymour, who was probably the leading Democrat in the state, that a civil war was unwinnable and would simply result in needless death. This is what Seymour said. There seems to be a radical mistake on the part of many people. They appear to think that the South can be conquered. Sir, this is impossible. You can destroy their habitats, devastate their fields, and shed the blood of their people, but you cannot conquer them. Okay. However, as many would soon find out, the patriotic fervor that swept the North in the weeks after the firing on Fort Sumter left no room for such opinions. So this is what I want you to know most about this topic. Preparing for war required the full mobilization of Northern society. And to fully mobilize Northern society, all dissent had to be crushed. No one would be allowed to publicly voice opposition to the war. Perhaps the most dramatic display of opposition came, okay. You got a little sneak preview. It came in June of 1861 in Goshen. And I don't know if you can see in the top right, you got 3 names coming down. And the third one down is A. Palmer. A. Palmer. And this is Andrew Palmer, a 54-year-old farmer who lived with his wife, Jane, and their 8 children. He owned considerable real estate and property. All right. It was valued over $6,500. You can multiply that by about 80 today. All right. To give you a sense of what he was worth. By June 22nd, for reasons that remain unknown, except for his statement that he, quote, had a right to put what flag he placed on his own property, Palmer was flying either a white peace flag or the more provocative flag of secession over his farm in Goshen. Whatever flag it was, it drew an angry and violent response from residents across the county. Palmer's farm, and it's up there on East Street North, you know, like across the street from the Torrington Country Club, that road, right? That's where he lived, up there. It was up very high. There were far fewer trees. Everybody in the town could see that Palmer was either flying a peace flag or a secession flag. And he also was making verbal statements supporting the Confederacy and daring his fellow residents to do something about his words and deeds. And they took him up on this, right? So Palmer stationed 2 of his sons out in front of the farm to defend the flag. And on Sunday, June 23rd, 1861, men leaving the Congregational Church services in Goshen had had enough. They sent a group, they deputized a group to go off to speak to Palmer at his farm. They told Palmer he needed to peacefully remove the flag or it would be forced down the next day, stating, quote, they would not pass and repass under its polluting shadow. So the next morning they sent a reconnaissance party out and the flag was still there. All right, now the accounts start to vary. But what is certainly true is that an armed mob was assembled, determined to forcibly take down the flag and to bring Palmer to justice. Estimates range from 100 men to 400 men. So even the low number is 100 men are assembled and armed, some of them, to march off to Palmer's house. Okay. There were, by one account, 70 muskets loaded with powder and ball, and a small piece of artillery brought with them out to the Palmer farm. There were men from Goshen and Litchfield and Morris and Cornwall, Bethlehem, Milton, Torrington, and Norfolk, all assembled to go take down this flag. So Palmer gets word of this, of course, and he took down the flag and he hid it. That was not good enough for the armed mob. They demanded the surrender of the offensive banner. And when this was refused, the newspaper reported, quote, real war was the result. Real war was the result. Now, much of this was pushing and shoving, but a musket was fired, and one man in the Herald identified him as Henry Catlin, in parentheses, Secesh, was shot in the leg. A correspondent for the Winstead Herald claimed that the crowd then made Palmer and his accomplices, quote, prisoners of war, and demanded that one of Palmer's sons turn over the flag, threatening to hang him if he led them astray. So the mob soon had the flag and warned the family that if another flag went up in its place, they would return and, quote, raise every building on the premises to the ground. And they left with Andrew Palmer in custody. They marched him back to the center of Goshen, forced him to swear loyalty to the government of the United States, and then released him. This event was a turning point for the newspapers, right? They called it a marked warning, and said that while, this is the Litchfield Inquirer, while they were, quote, no advocates of mob law, the Palmer affair tells traitors that they cannot raise the emblem and insignia of rebellion with impunity in the free air of our Litchfield hills. Though the traitors are despicable in number, they are insidious in their plots. They must be marked. They are marked. And some people started to hang a noose in the center of Litchfield with the sign for traitors right next to it, sending that message. Okay, so we should point out that the end of the Palmer affair did not stop pro-secessionist talk, anti-war talk. This is George Woodruff. He was Litchfield County's Democratic congressman. And the Inquirer reported that a large group of men of, quote, secessionist proclivities came to see Woodruff, and they met him behind closed doors and hatched a plot, right? Some sort of pro-Confederate plot. And Woodruff threw them out of his office. There's no evidence that this took place. There's no evidence that this took place. But what we start to see here is Litchfield County residents believing that there are conspiracists at work in their own backyards, right? Trying to sink the war effort. All right, now some of this stuff is a little more fun, than the stuff that's going on in Goshen. Next door, well, 2 buildings over, at the Episcopal Church, a quote, Litchfield Copperhead wanted to have his son baptized with the name Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, you know, like Jefferson Davis Smith. And, you know, Esther Thompson wrote that the rector didn't want to oversee a rite in which the child was given the name of the Confederate president. This is Esther Thompson. The rector remonstrated, but his objections were overruled by the shrewd arguments of the parishioner, who reminded the minister that an Episcopal clergyman had no right to refuse the sacrament of baptism for the children of a communicant of his church. So while the minister was forced to proceed with the service, these rules didn't apply to the church's musicians. So William Baldwin, right, who was a member of the church's choir, sprang to his feet. This is Thompson, sprang to his feet, his face white as marble and perceptibly shaking from head to foot, bent over the organist, exclaiming in a half-audible whisper, "Give them the Star-Spangled Banner. Give it to them. Give it to them." So he could force the baptism of the name Jefferson Davis, but they could force the playing of the Star-Spangled Banner. And so this is in the collection here at the Historical Society, and I love this so much because this is like an envelope mailer thing. And if you notice on the left, right, it says Jeff Davis going to war. And then you turn it on the side and it says returning, and he's a jackass. Right? You see it? The Union defeat at Bull Run in July 1861 led to a surge in dissent, with a notable change, however. After Bull Run, nobody in Litchfield County is flying Confederate flags anymore, right? They are flying the peace flags, however, usually white, as we mentioned, but sometimes black. Edward Phelps, who was a one-time general in the Connecticut militia, and a neighbor did raise a black flag on Independence Day to signify their aversion to the glorious old banner of a once prospered and united nation. This same week, Cornwall Doolittle, a 51-year-old manufacturer from Barkhamsted, quote, hoisted a white flag with the inscription "Peace and Union." Anti-war meetings were held in Canaan and Sharon. In Sharon, the opposition to the war was expressed in financial terms. Resolved that the cost of this unnatural war will entail upon the people a system of taxation too intolerable to be borne. So the largest meeting took place in Cornwall in 1861 in the summer. There were over 500 people. 500 people attended. They had a rail car that they used as a platform for speakers, and resolutions advocated a, quote, peaceful separation, and proclaimed that the American Union is forever destroyed. Speakers encouraged other towns to take a stand against a further continuance of this bloody spectacle. It ultimately failed, however. These resolutions failed. John Cotton Smith, he had recently served as the U.S. Minister to Bolivia. He was from Sharon. He spoke and perhaps disappointed the crowd in saying that he deprecated the horrors of civil war, but he was loyal to the flag under which he was born and which he had seen honored upon the high seas and in the harbors of foreign lands. And he must have been persuasive, because the Inquirer reported that the final outcome of the meeting was a resolution supporting Lincoln's actions and the, quote, integrity and stability of the government. Let me just say, this is a common theme. They present this act of dissent, this act of defiance, and then they say, but this influential person changed their minds, right? You see that over and over and over again. On the streets of Litchfield, I apologize, I try and I can't get this to not be blurry, but on the streets of Litchfield, opposition to the war, okay, turned violent in the summer of 1861. In August 1861, a fight broke out at Wheeler's Grocery, right down the street, between some, quote, peacemen, that's what they called themselves, passing through the town, and a resident by the last name of Sedgwick, who was seriously injured with a cut with a heavy weight on his forehead. Some of the peacemen were arrested. The Inquirer declared about these episodes, there were more of these. We still live, meaning supporters of the war. And if any of these ruffians will pay Litchfield and the Inquirer a visit, they may be led to perceive the difference between receiving a little cold lead and upsetting it. Right? So we see threats of violence. Now, in the wake of all of this, Litchfield forms vigilance committees, right? Vigilantes whose job it is to go out and stamp out the dissent. On July 24th, the Vigilance Committee formed up. They put a drummer and a flag bearer at their head, and they marched down South Street to the home of George Palmer, who appears to not be a relationship to Andrew up in Goshen. Esther Thompson remembered that Palmer dabbled in fortune telling and told everyone he was a copperhead. He further agitated his patriotic townsmen by telling one of them he hoped his sons, meaning not Palmer's sons, the townsmen's sons, would die of disease in the army. And he used profane epithets when speaking of President Lincoln. So when the crowd got to Palmer's house, he was hiding in the garret. And the crowd nailed an American flag to the roof. And despite repeated attempts for Palmer to come out and thank them for this action, they got no reply and they disbanded for the night. But the next night, they marched up to Prospect Street to the home of Dr. E.W. Blake, who was a dentist. And they, quote, begged of him the favor of waving the stars and stripes. They asked him, will you please wave the flag for us? And Blake said he really couldn't do that because his wife had Southern relations, relatives, and they would be upset to hear that he had done this. And they said, fine, you don't have to do it. Will you nail a flag to your window? Okay. And at first, he didn't want to do that either. But then some threats were made and he agreed. But then they also made him give a patriotic speech, which drew tears to the eyes of many of the listeners. So here's this thing. They've turned this person, right? Here's that theme. We turned this person. And then the crowd cheered. And then Blake asked their names and he wrote them all down. We'll come back to that. And then the vigilance group went off and they made one more stop that night at the home of Linus Parmalee. He was a 62-year-old wagon maker on South Street. So Esther Thompson wrote that Parmalee was nowhere to be seen, but his wife was. Okay. And she, quote, met them at her door to parry with them. She begged to swing the flag herself as her husband was asleep and should not be disturbed. This plea not availing, she spied one of the ringleaders of the band by the gate, a talented but over-scrupulous young lawyer, and affecting much joy at seeing him, ran down to meet him and extending her hand exclaimed, "Good evening, Mr. X. I am so glad to see you. I suppose you have come to pay that little debt that you have owed my husband for so long." This greeting was answered by a roar of laughter by the crowd, and they acknowledged their defeat by a speedy departure. Thus, Thursday night ended peacefully. Friday, however, was a different story. Dr. Blake, angered over the events of the night before, and armed with both the list of names that he had acquired and a heavy walking stick, set out to exact some revenge. So the first man on the list he found was Henry Spencer. He found him right out here on West Street. Attorney H.B. Graves heard a commotion, and he rushed to Spencer's assistance. He was being clubbed, and when Graves got there, Blake hit him over the head with a porcelain pitcher and opened a gash on his head. We talked about the militaristic language. So the Inquirer reports on this in the same way that they would report on a battle. The dentist had erected a skillful entrenchment. Siege was at once laid to unearth the enemy. The outer works yielded, and Blake was taken prisoner. Blake quickly asked forgiveness of the injured and was forgiven by at least one of them, and so was allowed to depart in peace. Right? So this is going on night after night. They go back to George Palmer's house. Right? They go back to George Palmer's house and they say, you took your flag down. You need to put it back up. But this time he's got a knife. Right? And George Palmer tries to fight them off, and they come to blows, and both Palmer and his wife are thrown to the ground and tied up and put in the back of a wagon. Okay. And while they're there, the Vigilance Committee, Oliver Peck tackles to the ground a New Haven newspaper man named Ira Addis. All right. And they tie Ira Addis up and they throw him in the wagon, and they bring them back here to the center of town. And they take Ira Addis and they dunk him in the well, which is right in front of this building. Right, covered up right out there in front of this building. And they dunk him again and again until he is, quote, thoroughly soused. And they demanded that he swear allegiance to the flag and ask forgiveness of the public, pledge his future fidelity to the Union, and print an article apologizing for his actions in his New Haven newspaper. And it says this, a pledge which he faithfully kept. Now, maybe he did, but I couldn't find any article, right? I couldn't find any article about it. Okay. All right. Squads of vigilantes, threatening home visits, heads dunked in wells, warnings of lynchings. The residents of Litchfield had made it clear that they would not tolerate any public utterances against the Union or the prosecution of the war. Despite these measures, however, dissent continued, and increasingly, the people of Litchfield County looked to the federal government to stamp it out. Now, by far the biggest and most important of these events, maybe not the biggest, the one in Cornwall was probably the biggest, but the most important took place on August 28th, 1861 in Morris. They had a large peace meeting. And the main draw was a man named Ellis Schnabel of Pennsylvania. He was a well-known critic of the war. He was wanted on charges in 4 states for speaking out against the war. A speaker's platform was set up in the center of town. A peace flag was hoisted up the flagpole, and Schnabel rose to speak, cheered by the crowd, many of whom were armed. Now, what Schnabel didn't know as he walked up onto the platform that day, cheered by the crowd, was that telegraph orders at that moment were being sent from Secretary of State William Seward in Washington, right, to the deputy sheriff in Litchfield, a man named Edward Peck. Right, orders to arrest Schnabel. They finally were able to pinpoint where he was because all the newspapers said Schnabel's coming, he's going to be here at this time. Okay, so as Schnabel is mounting the platform, he is handed a note by Sheriff Peck. They let him speak. And as he's descending the platform, they hand him the note saying he's under arrest for treasonous speech. And Schnabel would spend the rest of the, or not the rest of the war, but considerable amount of time here at Fort Lafayette in Brooklyn. The local leaders of the event, by the way, dismayed by what they heard and had seen, quickly hauled down their police banner, cut the halyards, And the Inquirer reported, "Never again, we hope, shall the heir of Morris be disgraced with its ill-omened vision." The arrest seemed to quiet dissent in the state. Governor Buckingham would tell Secretary of the Navy and Connecticut native Gideon Wells that Schnabel's arrest was the best news I have heard today. I trust and know it will have a just effect upon traders here. And P.T. Barnum, the famed showman and future politician, he told Lincoln that Schnabel's incarceration had, quote, made secessionists so scarce, I cannot find one to exhibit in my museum. Soldiers were particularly happy to see, particularly happy to see dissent stamped out. Alva Stone of Litchfield, who was in the army at the time, he would tell his wife, he would write to his wife to give his respects to all, quote, Union friends, but to shoot the first man that blows any secession around you. And of Schnabel's arrest, he commented, I see by the paper that Schnabel of peace meeting notoriety is fighting in the rebel army in Arkansas. And so he has at least found his proper place while his audience are deserting the cause of the rebels and trying to creep back into decent society. What has become of your peacemen that used to congregate in your village? I also can find no evidence that Schnabel was in the Confederate Army, right? I think this is largely just rumor. But the point is, this arrest really dampens the peace movement. For those fighting to defeat secessionists in the South, the victory over dissenters at home was welcome news. Mobilization meant more than recruiting men to enlist and outfitting them for war. It also meant bringing all aspects of society together to support the war effort. It's evident that both individuals and government officials worked to stifle expression of any sentiment other than total support of the war effort. The result was an assault on civil liberties that took the forms of physical abuse, public humiliation, or imprisonment. Still, if the intent was to foster complete societal support for the war, that failed. In the first months of 1862, William Buckingham mounted his campaign for a fourth term as governor. Both the Inquirer and the Herald launched ferocious attacks on Democratic candidates, sharing the view that individual Democratic candidates were to be painted as traitors. Not content to limit their attack to the Democratic politicians, the county papers also attacked Democratic voters. All who refuse to take a hold and manly stand in the Union support are justly liable to the imputation of being secret foes. A conditional Union man is an unconditional traitor. Voting for the Republican ticket is our duty now. In a county where there were only Republican newspapers, Democratic voters had no local alternatives for the news. In the local newspapers, they read that if they voted for their party of choice, they were nothing more than traitorous heathens. If the severity of these attacks suggests that the Republican papers feared that the Democratic candidates had considerable strength, they also clearly demonstrate another point. For all the work done to stamp out dissent and opposing viewpoints in Litchfield County in 1861, partisan politics did not stop. Even amidst the threats of violence and imprisonment and the coming recruiting drives, party bickering lived on amidst the hills of northwestern Connecticut. Thank you. Thank you. Kate, we have time for questions if there's questions. Excellent. Questions? We'll go in the back and then we'll come over here.
So you had, I'm one of his former.
That's true.
You had mentioned that there were towns in Litchfield County that tended to lean Democrat.
Yeah.
Did they still lean Democrat during the war in their elections, or did they?
They did. There's very little change in the voting patterns. Lincoln countywide gets more votes in 1864 than he did in 1860. But if you look at local elections, the margins stay pretty close. And we should say, Democrats tended to live in the countryside while Republicans tended to live in the town centers.
No, actually, I was just gonna ask the same thing. During, I think, the wake of the war, the South finally conceded. If the voting patterns have changed in Connecticut, if not New England more broadly, but in Connecticut, it sounded like it didn't change very.
They don't change much. The Republicans tend to hold statewide offices even after the war, but at the local level, they stay. Some of the smaller towns tend to be more Democratic because they're less centralized.
Because Lincoln's reelection lost New York City, but won the rest of the state. Just a little bit of a surprise for most of us. Like we think just the opposite. It sounds like Connecticut was following this trend.
Yes, and that's true across a lot of the North. Yeah, absolutely. Sean, do we have a?
Someone was asking, you were talking about those peacemen who came into Litchfield and the newspaper kind of reported on them. Was there any indication of where those individuals were from?
So this is true of so many different aspects, right? They tend often not to name names. So they do in some of these instances, like Dr. Blake gets named and Cornwall Doolittle gets named. And there's an earlier one as well that we talked about. But oftentimes it's a them. The women of New Milford will say they will never marry somebody who got a medical exemption to get out of the war, right? The women, they don't say Sally Jones of Main Street said this, right? So they talk in these general terms, and that's a common trend that we see. Yeah. Richard.
Do you have any idea how many in total in Litchfield County served
Total in Litchfield County?
in the war?
I think the number is about 3,200. It's a considerable number. It's probably the county numbers are throwing me a little bit here, but so if we talked about just in Litchfield, it's about 330 men go off to war just from Litchfield, right? And the numbers are just under 100 that will die in the war. We're talking battle and disease, and we're not including the men whose lives are irreparably changed by imprisonment, disease, battle wounds, fatigue, trauma. Yeah, they don't show up on those, but it's the numbers are large. In the summer of 1862, there were about 1,600 men from Litchfield County who went off to war. And that recruiting drive that summer is about half of the total number of men.
Did the divisiveness continue after the war, and for how long?
I love this question so much. And for the people at home, the question is, did the divisiveness continue after the war? And if so, for how long? Here's what happens after the war. A collective memory is formed that the war was the central moment of their lives and the central moment of their nation. And it was a good war. And these men went off and fought in it and died in it, and we're going to remember them. And there's no place in society for those people who didn't support it. So I'll just give you one example that's sort of tangentially related. There were hundreds and hundreds of men in a 3.5-day period Dr. Josiah Beckwith, who lived across the street, right? He lived next to the post office. The house is still there. In a 3.5-day period, he gave medical exemptions to 700 men. He did 700 medical exemptions in, he did about, well, I don't know the number. He exempted 700, and that was about 90% of everyone who went to him. So we can do the math and say 800-ish, right? About 800 medical exams in 3.5 days. These men came from all over the county. So I looked in the 30, 40 years after the war. I looked wherever I could find. Here were the men who were a board of selectmen, and here were men who were state representatives and probate clerks and probate judges and the dog catcher and the this and the that. You can't find any of those names on the list. They were excluded from post-war society if you oppose that war, right? And the same thing is true of Blake or Palmer or these guys. Yeah. I'm sorry, about Beckwith?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's another story. But suffice it to say, he was politically active before the war and never again after. Yes, please, and then we'll go. Oh, great question. Ages of conscription were 18 to 44. 18 to 44. And those were also the ages for volunteers. For enlisted men, officers could be older. And we have all kinds of stories, of course, of men who are older and younger. But my favorite one, it's in the book. Ira Thomas was from Woodbury. He was 61 years old. And they said that he took grease and he put it in his white hair to make himself look younger, and went and volunteered. And he said, I'm 44. I love this. I'm 44 and a half or something like that, he said, right? And I said, this doesn't sound right, right? This sounds like legend. But I found his obituary, and he was 61 years old in 1862. Yeah. So, and then there were men who were 15 and 16 years old as well. And some of them were great soldiers, and some of them were terrible soldiers, right? And that's what we find, that they're all stripes. These men were of all different backgrounds and had all different levels of success.
This may fall outside of the scope of Litchfield County, but did you get a sense of what the South thought of their northern allies who were secessionists?
Oh, like these copperheads.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All these folks are
This is a great question. So for Zoom, the question is, what did Southerners think of their presumptive Northern allies, the Copperheads, etc.? Southerners were very sophisticated in their thinking about the war. So let's say Robert E. Lee, for example, understood the political dimensions of it. So on 2 occasions, Lee invades the North, in the summer of 1862 and in the summer of 1863. And in both of those instances, he's going north in attempts to, now he's trying to do other things as well, but he's looking to disrupt the coming elections. Because if the North is having important gubernatorial elections and of course congressional elections in 1862. How are those elections going to go for the Lincoln administration if the Confederate Army is sitting in Pennsylvania? Right? It's going to lead to Democratic victories, and those Democrats, he believes, will come to the negotiating table, right? Not thinking they can defeat the North in traditional senses on the battlefield, but there's other ways to win a victory as well. Yeah. So it's an important part of some strategy. That's a great question. Roberta.
A follow-up.
Yes, please.
So the thinking is that it was from fear that they would go,
Not so much like we're afraid that the Confederates are here. Not so much that we're afraid that the Confederates are here and they might burn our houses. That this is a clear sign that the Lincoln administration cannot win this war. They can't even keep the Confederates out of Pennsylvania. How are they going to win? Yeah.
What's the significance? How does the the tablet on the green fit into your story? That,
The recruiting station. Yeah, that's like at the heart of it, right? That's at the heart of this book. And I'm fascinated by a couple of things here on some of these monuments. Camp Dutton, if you go down to Camp Dutton, you know, off of Camp Dutton Road, but off of Chestnut Hill, the monument says erected by the survivors, not erected by veterans, the survivors, right? That language I thought was so important. And then they build a monument to recruiting, and they build a monument to the training camp. I think that's a really interesting thing. Now, I will tell you, I can't find one shred of evidence that there was actually a recruiting station there. Can't find one piece of it. The closest thing, I don't know if we're going to be able to see this. Oh yeah, we can see this. Uh-oh, I'm going to leave the Zoom for a second. Can you see this tent? Someone said, well, then maybe that's the recruiting office. I don't think so. I think that's a tent for dignitaries that are there reviewing the men as they leave for war, right? There is evidence that there was a recruiting office at the Litchfield Inquirer newspaper's office, right? Because one of the editor of the Inquirer was also a recruiting officer. And there's evidence that he was running that out of his office, which was across the street from where that monument is today. So I don't think it's marking the exact site. I think it's telling a story. Yeah, I like that question. Anybody else? All right. Jerry.
I'm talking about the process. Did you end up leaving on the lot?
My wife's sitting here. Do you want to field that one? This was a project that I began maybe in 2018, serious research on this in 2018 in the archives. And I had by the end of 2019, I had amassed a lot of research. And you know how it is. Will I ever get the time to write? And then remember, we weren't allowed to leave our homes. And I got giant sheets of paper and wrote by hand day after day after day, giant sheets of paper. And I wrote 130,000 words. And the editor said, you get 70,000. So there's 65,000 words. What I will say though is the editor, as they usually are, was correct. It's a better book at 70,000 words than it would have been at 130,000. I would be very, very happy if I could have 5,000 more words. That it was very difficult. I think writing and editing was a 2-year process, more or less, maybe a 3-year process, divided evenly between writing all of those words and then cutting all of those words. Yeah.
So as a journalist, I'll ask, if you had those 5,000 words, what would?
The 5,000 words that I would like back.
It's a better way to frame it, yeah.
This is what I said to the editor. Could I just cut every other word? But the 5,000 words that I would like back, and this might just be as a historian speaking, are the parts that put this book in a broader context. Both the national story and the historiographical part of it about what have other historians written about this? How does this fit into what other people have done? And so my whole premise is that there's nothing different in Litchfield. What's going on in Litchfield County is the same thing that's going on in Adams County, Pennsylvania. It's the same story. So I wanted to try to show that. Yeah, so that's a lot of what got cut. And then a lot of just examples, right? Let's just get to the best example. Terrific, all right? Thank you all very much.
Thank you.